The newspaper is folded twice, and the fold has gone soft with age. It is a regional paper, the kind printed in a county seat, circulated to towns whose names appear on no interstate sign, and it is dated sometime in the early 1960s. The paper has that particular weight of mid-century newsprint, substantial but not heavy, the kind that leaves a faint gray residue on the fingertips after a few minutes of handling. The community advisory column it is open to sits in the lower right quarter of an interior page, beneath a notice about a church rummage sale and beside a 2-inch advertisement for a hardware store. The column is not long. It takes up perhaps 4 inches of a single newspaper column, set in the same plain typeface used to describe road conditions and school board decisions. There is no photograph. There is no headline that reaches for drama. The headline says something plain and functional, the kind of language a town uses when it wants to tell its neighbors something useful without alarming them unnecessarily. The advisory describes a woman driving home alone at night. A truck began following her some miles back, its headlights staying close behind her through 2 or 3 turns she would not have expected a stranger to follow. By the time she reached her street, she was frightened enough to pull into a neighbor's driveway rather than her own. The truck did not pull in after her. It continued past, slowly. The column does not say who the woman was. It does not say what town this happened in, exactly. It says something like, "This happened recently, in our area, to a woman known to several readers of this paper." It recommends that women driving alone at night be attentive to the vehicles behind them. It recommends keeping the doors locked. It recommends that, if followed, a driver should not pull into her own driveway, but should instead drive to a well-lit public place. The tone is neighborly. There is nothing sensational in it. It reads the way a notice about an icy intersection reads, or a warning about a stretch of poorly lit county road, or a reminder that the pharmacy will close an hour early on Thursdays this month. The column is giving its readers something practical to know, something a friend might say, lowering her voice slightly over a telephone. This is where the story starts, or rather, this is one of the places where the story was already fully formed and already traveling when someone first thought to write it down. Because when Jan Harold Brunvand, a folklorist at the University of Utah, began collecting and cataloging stories like this one in the years leading up to his 1981 book on American urban legends, what he found was that the story had not begun. It had simply arrived. Every version he documented was already old by the time someone gave it to him. Every teller had heard it from someone else. The newspaper column in the county seat was not an origin point. It was a record of something that had already been said aloud in some form dozens or hundreds of times before anyone thought to print it. The book that Brunvand published in 1981 was called The Vanishing Hitchhiker, American Urban Legends and Their Meanings, and it would eventually be recognized as one of the foundational texts in the academic study of contemporary folklore. Among the stories he documented and examined was what he called the Backseat Stranger legend, a story whose structure was so consistent across so many different states and so many different tellings that its consistency became, in itself, one of the most interesting things about it. Brunvand did not claim to have found the story's origin. What he found instead was that the story, wherever he looked, was already there. The search for early print appearances of the Backseat Stranger story led researchers into the regional newspaper archives of the late 1950s and early 1960s, and what those archives showed was consistent. The story appeared in community columns, in safety advisories, in letters to local editors, and it appeared in virtually the same form wherever it turned up. A woman driving alone. Something unusual about the behavior of someone she encountered along the way. A revelation when the journey ended that she had not been as alone in her car as she thought. The specific geography changed. The makes of the cars changed. The highway numbers changed. The story did not change. The version that had crystallized most strongly by the mid-1960s, the version that would go on to be the dominant form for decades, had a structure as clean as a folk tale. 3 acts, practically speaking. In the first, a woman stops at a gas station late at night. In the second, the gas station attendant behaves in some way that is strange or urgent or alarming. He delays her. He asks her something odd. He seems to want her inside the station rather than back in her car. In the third, the reason for his behavior is revealed. There is someone crouching in the back seat of her car, hiding behind the front seats, or beneath a blanket, or folded into the space behind the rear bench, and the attendant saw them through the window when he came to fill the tank. The woman is safe. The attendant understood the danger before she did, and he found a way to get her clear of it. The story ends there, without elaboration. The 3-act structure is worth sitting with for a moment, because it does something very particular. It begins in a place of comfort, a familiar roadside institution, a uniformed employee, the ordinary ritual of stopping for gas, and it plants unease inside that comfort by changing the behavior of the person who should be reassuring. The attendant is not calm. His strangeness is the story's first signal that something is wrong, but the story withholds the nature of the wrongness for just long enough to let that signal build. And then the revelation comes, and the woman is safe, and the danger was never hers to face alone because someone noticed and intervened. The story is not, at its end, a story about catastrophe. It is a story about a near miss. Someone looked, someone acted, the woman drove home. In the southern states during the 1960s and into the 1970s, the versions of the story that circulated most often had a somewhat different geography and a somewhat different mechanism of warning. The gas station was sometimes replaced by a pursuing vehicle, a pickup truck whose driver had seen the figure in the back seat when he pulled alongside the woman's car somewhere on a rural highway, and who then followed her, flashing his headlights urgently, trying to communicate something she could not understand until she was safe. These versions place the action on long stretches of 2-lane road at night, the kind of road that had very little traffic and very few lights, and very long distances between one town and the next. The setting matched the experience of driving in much of the rural South, where distances were real and a person could drive for a long time without encountering a building that was lit. In the Northeast and Midwest during the same period, the setting shifted. The rural highway gave way to the suburban parking lot, wide, mostly empty at night, lit by the specific orange-yellow light of sodium vapor lamps that turned everything the color of old photographs. Department store parking lots, hospital parking structures, highway rest stops with their particular mix of truck idling sounds and overhead lighting. The women in these versions were not driving home from a distant town. They were walking from a store to their car, in a lot that was full of cars and empty of people, and the discovery of what waited in the back seat came not at a gas station, but at the moment of returning to a vehicle parked in a place that had seemed entirely ordinary when they left it. These versions spoke to the anxieties of suburban life, to the experience of ordinary errands and familiar places turned suddenly strange, to the way that a parking lot under sodium lights at 9 in the evening is a different place than a parking lot under afternoon sun. Folklorists who examined these regional variations noted that they were not accidental. The geography of each version was native to the experience of the people telling it. A story that circulated in rural Mississippi in 1968 did not need a suburban parking structure because the world it described had to feel immediately real to the person hearing it. The setting was an argument for the story's truth. Of course, this could happen, the setting said. It happened on a road like the one outside your window. It happened in a parking lot like the one at the shopping center on Route 9. The story did not ask to be believed in the abstract. It asked to be believed in the specific, and it changed its specifics to match wherever it found itself. A gas station at dusk in 1966 has a particular quality of light. The canopy over the pumps holds 2 or 4 bare bulbs that have just switched on against the deepening evening sky, and the concrete apron under them is still holding some of the day's warmth. A uniformed attendant, this is a full-service station, the kind that no longer exists in most of the country, walks out to the driver's side of a car that has just pulled off the 2-lane highway and into the lot. He is wearing a cap and a shirt with his name on it. His job is to fill the tank, check the oil if asked, clean the windshield, and take the money. He is supposed to be unremarkable. He is supposed to be the most ordinary stop of the night. The story requires him not to be ordinary. The story requires something in his manner to register as wrong, and the particular nature of that wrongness varies by version. Sometimes he is too solicitous, wanting her to come inside and pay rather than pay at the pump. Sometimes he is rigid and careful in a way that does not fit the situation. Sometimes he simply looks at the back of her car for slightly too long. The listener of the story is told what the woman in the car does not yet know, or the listener is kept in the dark alongside her, depending on the version. Either way, the attendant's behavior is the hinge on which the whole story turns, and it does its job by being just ambiguous enough. He could be odd for any number of reasons. He could simply be having a bad shift. The women at the center of these stories were consistently women. Across all the early documented versions, regardless of geography or regional variation, the protagonist was a woman traveling alone at night. Brunvand noted this, and Patricia Turner, a folklorist whose work examined the racial and gender dimensions of American legend traditions, wrote about it as well. The consistency was not incidental. It reflected something specific about the mid-20th century moment in which the story emerged and spread most rapidly, a moment when women were driving alone at night in larger numbers than previous generations, when women's mobility and independence had expanded considerably, and when the culture was still in the process of assimilating that change. The story encoded an anxiety that was real and widely felt. Not the anxiety that women invented or exaggerated, but the social anxiety about women in spaces that had recently been considered less available to them, alone on the highway, alone at the rest stop, alone in the parking structure after dark. The story did not tell women not to drive alone. It told women who drove alone what to watch for. It told them that the attendant might be a protector. It told them that someone might notice. In this way, it was both a reflection of anxiety and a partial narrative response to it, not a resolution, not a reassurance that danger did not exist, but a story in which the woman survived, in which someone intervened, in which the threat was named, and the woman was safe by the end. The story performed a kind of work that is harder to measure than the work of a safety pamphlet, but may, in its way, be just as practical. By the early 1970s, the story was old enough that the people telling it could not say when they had first heard it. A woman in Ohio, if asked, might say she had heard it from her sister-in-law, who heard it from a woman in her church choir who had read it in the newspaper, or been told it at a neighborhood meeting, or received a call from a friend who wanted to make sure she knew. The chain of transmission was long and tangled by then, and no one held the end of it. The story had become part of what people in a given region simply knew, the way they knew to watch for ice in the underpass on cold mornings, or to leave 10 minutes earlier when the highway was being repaved. It was a thing that was simply known, that had been known for some time, that it was reasonable to pass on to someone who might not have heard it yet. In Salt Lake City, in the late 1970s, a researcher was sitting at a reading table in a university library with a set of index cards spread across the surface in front of him. Jan Harold Brunvand had been collecting versions of this story for years by this point, gathering them from correspondents across the country, folklorists and their students, newspaper editors who had run community safety columns, people who had written to him directly after hearing about his interest. Each card in his collection represented a version of the story from a different source. Each card had a date, a state, a note about the setting, rural highway, suburban lot, small town gas station, and a brief summary of how the version differed from the others. The cards were numerous, dozens of them. When they were spread across the table, they looked at a certain angle, like the kind of evidence that a researcher gathers when they are not looking for something specific and then discovers that something specific is very much there. The story from a small city in Nebraska was functionally identical to the story from a suburb of Atlanta, which was functionally identical to the story from a township in western Pennsylvania, which echoed a version collected in coastal Oregon. The highway numbers were different. The year the woman was said to be driving was different. The make of her car was different. The story was the same. This is the thing that Brunvand found, and that his 1981 book documented with the patient care of a researcher who understands that consistency is itself a finding. The story was not spreading because one original teller had sent it outward in all directions. The story was not spreading in any single traceable direction at all. It was arriving fully formed in dozens of places nearly simultaneously, carried by ordinary conversation and ordinary social concern, attaching itself to whatever geography and vehicle model felt right to whoever was telling it at that moment. The story knew how to become local without losing its shape. Every version was the same story. Every version felt like it had happened nearby. The index cards on Brunvand's reading table in Salt Lake City were not a map of the story's origin. They were a record of its distribution. And distribution, in the case of a story like this one, a story told person to person, adjusted slightly with each telling to fit the world of the new teller and the new listener, does not point back to a single source. It points outward in every direction at once, the way ripples move across water when the water is disturbed, not at one point, but across its entire surface, all at the same time. The woman in the 1962 Ford Falcon has been on a straight Midwestern road for a while now, and there is a pair of headlights in her rearview mirror that she has been aware of for the last several exits. She cannot tell, from this distance, what kind of vehicle it is. The headlights are just headlights, 2 points of light at a fixed distance behind her, following the road as she follows it, present when she expected it might have turned away. She has not decided yet what she thinks about this. It may be nothing. It probably is nothing. Most things that seem like something in the ordinary course of driving home late at night are nothing. The road is flat, and the fields on either side are dark. There are no other cars visible in either direction. The heater in the Falcon is working, and the radio is on at low volume, playing something that does not quite hold her attention. The speedometer holds steady. The headlights in the mirror hold their distance. Whether this particular woman's particular drive ever ended in anything other than her own driveway is not something any archive records. She is not a documented case. She is a composite, assembled from the accumulated telling of a story that found its way into many hands before it was ever written down, a woman who represented a recognizable experience, the experience of a solitary drive at night, in a time when solitary night driving was becoming something more women did, and something the culture was still in the process of deciding what to make of. She is the woman the story needed in order to do the thing it was trying to do. The newspaper folded to the community advisory column was one artifact of that process. The index cards spread across the reading table in Salt Lake City were another. Between them, in the years that separated them, was a very large number of conversations. Neighbors on telephones, women at church meetings, men who had heard the story from their wives and passed it to their coworkers, county paper editors who ran safety columns because it seemed like the right thing to do. The story moved through all of these channels quietly and consistently, changing its clothes to suit each new context and keeping its shape underneath. What Brunvan's index cards showed, fanned out across the library table in the particular quality of light that fills a university reading room on a weekday afternoon, was not that the story was true or false, local or distant, recent or old. What they showed was that the story was everywhere. Dozens of nearly identical narratives, collected from different states, attributed to different highways, placed in different decades, arriving at the same three-act conclusion, carried in different hands across hundreds of miles of American road, an American suburb, an American small town, and setting down, each time, in a new place that promptly claimed it as its own. That consistency, not the dramatic consistency of a lie that has been carefully coordinated, but the quieter consistency of a story that knows what it needs to be and finds its way there naturally, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about these cards. A story this widely distributed, this geographically varied, this organically transmitted, should show more drift. Individual details should have wandered further from the center. The core should have eroded or split into something unrecognizable. Instead, every card records the same essential shape: the woman, the night, the person who noticed, the hidden figure, the safety at the end. Whatever this story was carrying, it carried it intact across 4 decades and 40 states and an uncountable number of conversations, and it was still recognizable as itself when it arrived at the library reading table, and it would remain recognizable as itself for a long time afterward. The index cards were proof of that. The way a specimen collected in an archive is proof that something once lived in a particular place, not a living thing anymore, but a record of one, pressed flat and annotated and placed in the care of someone who understood its value. Outside the library, the late afternoon was whatever the late afternoon in Salt Lake City in the late 1970s was. Someone was driving home. Someone was stopping for gas. Someone was pulling into a parking lot and walking toward a store and thinking about what to make for dinner. The story was somewhere in all of that too, not on a shelf, not on a card, but moving through the ordinary afternoon in the way that stories move when they have been told enough times to become part of what a place simply knows. The researcher gathered his cards from the table at the end of the day and placed them in a folder, and the folder went into a bag, and the work went on. The story went on as well by other means, through other channels, in the mouths of people who had no idea a folklorist in Utah was collecting it. They were just passing something along that someone had told them, something that seemed worth passing along about a woman driving home at night and what waited in the back seat of her car and what another person noticed in time and how she arrived safely at the end. The cards fanned across that reading table recorded dozens of such accounts from as many separate corners of the country, with only the highway number changed, and the year and the specific color of the car, and the patience required to spread them all out and look at what they made together was the patience of a researcher who understood that consistency at this scale is not an accident, and that the interesting question is not whether the story is true, but what it means that so many people in so many places needed it to be. A piece of chalk touched a chalkboard in a room that smelled of old wood and radiator heat, and the letters it left behind were four: F-O-A. The folklorist who wrote them stepped back and let the room look at what he had written. Outside the window of that seminar room, somewhere in the middle of the 1970s, in a university building whose hallways were lined with corkboards and course listings, the afternoon was doing whatever afternoons did in that decade, going its own way, unconcerned. Inside, a student near the back of the room felt something happen in the region of recognition. She had heard the story, not the story she had been told in this class, not a story from a textbook, but this story. Her mother had told it to her, about a friend of someone her mother knew, about a woman who had stopped for gas on the way home one night, and the attendant had seen something, and the woman had been safe, and it had happened to someone real, someone just beyond the reach of the telling. The folklorist turned back to the board. Friend of a friend, he underlined the phrase in chalk and explained what it meant in the formal vocabulary of his discipline, a transmission structure in which a story is attributed to a source one or two social links removed from the teller, near enough to feel true, but far enough that no one could pick up a telephone and ask the person directly whether it had happened. The student in the back row, the one with the particular feeling of recognition, did not say anything. She sat with the knowledge quietly, the way a person sits with the realization that something they have carried as a private fact turns out to be a named and documented thing, a thing with its own category in a filing system, a thing that thousands of other people had also been carrying, without knowing it, had been cataloged. The formal definition of what she had been told begins in a fairly modest place. Urban legends, as the scholars who study them have taken care to specify, are not simply false stories or widely circulated rumors. They are a particular kind of narrative, contemporary, oral, in origin even when they travel through print, presented by the teller as genuinely true, attributed to a credible source that is always just beyond direct reach, and structured around an implicit warning or lesson that makes the story useful to the community passing it along. Richard Dorson, working in the mid-20th century, was among the first to give serious academic attention to this category of story, and to argue that it deserved to be treated not as error or credulity, but as a legitimate form of cultural expression with its own internal logic. Jan Harold Brunvand extended that work through decades of careful collection and analysis. Gary Allen Fine brought sociological precision to questions of how and why particular stories found the audiences they found. All three, working separately and together, returned repeatedly to a particular example: a woman, a gas station, a figure hidden behind the rear seat. The story seemed almost to present itself as a demonstration of its own principles. The attribution structure that the folklorist wrote on the chalkboard had been named, by the scholars Peter Dagi and Adam Vasson, with a kind of affectionate precision. Friend of a friend, FOF, captured exactly the slight but crucial distance that makes a story of this kind work. Close enough that the listener trusts the source, far enough that the listener cannot call the source and ask for the original person's name and phone number. The woman who was driving was a friend of someone's cousin. She worked with someone's former neighbor. She lived in the next town over, or 2 towns over, or across the state. but not so far that the story could not travel back on its own. If the story had happened to the teller directly, it would carry a different weight, personal testimony, self-report, something that could be questioned or investigated. If it had happened to a complete stranger with no connection, it would feel too distant, too abstract, too much like a news report to carry the warmth and urgency a useful cautionary story needs. The friend of a friend sits exactly at the midpoint, close enough to feel, far enough to persist. The student in the back row had not thought about any of this when her mother told her the story. She had thought, this is real. She had thought this happens. She had, in subsequent months and years, behaved accordingly, checking the back seat of her car at night, parking under lights, noticing how the interior of a car parked in a dark lot looked from the outside, whether a person could see into it or not. None of this had felt to her like the result of a story. It had felt like common sense. It had felt like information. The distinction between those two categories, it turned out, was exactly what the field of folklore had spent several decades trying to carefully and sympathetically examine. Linda Day argued, over a long career spent examining cautionary legends and the communities that carried them, that stories of this kind performed a real and valued social function. In a community without formal channels for distributing certain kinds of practical knowledge about which streets were dangerous, which hours were risky, which behaviors left a person vulnerable, stories traveled where pamphlets could not. They moved through social networks that no institution had designed or maintained. They arrived in kitchens and cars and backyards, told by people who were trusted, in the particular tone of someone sharing something they believed the listener needed to know. The lesson embedded in the story was not stated as a list of rules. It was felt as a narrative, as something that had happened to someone real, as evidence rather than instruction. And because it arrived as evidence, it was retained in a way that instruction rarely is. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it shifts the question from whether the story is true to what the story does. Dev's argument was not that the stories were accurate accounts of events. Her argument was that the stories were accurate accounts of anxieties, shared, real, community-held concerns about genuine categories of vulnerability, and that the narrative form was simply the most effective technology available for transmitting those concerns from one person to another, across distances and time, without any central authority organizing the transmission. The Backseat Stranger story was not a news report. It was something closer to a distributed safety advisory, moving through the social fabric on its own, finding people who needed to hear it, arriving in the voice of someone they trusted. Among the post-war American roadway legends that folklorists have mapped and grouped together, the Backseat Stranger story is one member of a recognizable cluster. The automobile had become, by the middle of the 20th century, the central technology of ordinary American life. It was where families spent hours together. It was how people got to work, and to church, and to their sister's house, and to the hospital. It was the defining symbol of independence and mobility in a culture that had built its geography around the assumption that everyone would have one. And it was also, when the circumstances were right, a small enclosed space with limited visibility, sitting unattended in a parking lot for hours at a time, not especially difficult to enter, holding in its back seat a space that a person of a certain size could occupy without being immediately visible to someone sitting in the front. The hook told of a different kind of danger at the edge of a car, the figure outside rather than the figure within. The vanishing hitchhiker told of someone welcomed into the car by the driver, only to disappear. The backseat stranger reversed that geography. The danger was already inside, already waiting, already sharing the sealed and private space of the vehicle before the driver had any knowledge of it. Each story located the danger in a different relationship to the car's interior, but all of them used the car as the site where the danger lived. Folklorists examining this cluster noted that this was not coincidence. The car concentrated specific kinds of anxiety in one physical object: the privacy of the interior, which felt safe, the physical vulnerability of the enclosed space, which was real, and the particular exposure that came with being a person in a car parked somewhere that was not home. The stories worked with what the car genuinely was, not with an invented geography of threat. The formal system that folklorists use to track and compare stories across cultures and time is large enough that finding the backseat stranger legend within it requires some patience, but the search is genuinely rewarding. Stith Thompson, working through the first half of the 20th century, compiled what became the standard reference for comparative tale analysis, a massive index of motifs, the recurring narrative elements that appear across folklore traditions in different cultures and different eras. The index is organized numerically, and moving through its sections is something like navigating a very large and carefully organized library of the human imagination, one where the books have been sorted not by author or place, but by what happens inside them. In the K series, where the motifs of deception are cataloged, there are entries for concealment as a form of trickery. There are entries for the hidden figure who is not what they appear to be, and for the warning that arrives from an unexpected source at the last possible moment. The Backseat Stranger story, read through the Thompson Index, is not a story that appeared fully formed in a 1950s American newspaper column. It is a story assembled from components that were already old when the newspaper columns were written, components that appear in tale traditions from cultures that had no automobiles and no gas stations and no suburban parking lots. The specific setting was new. The underlying architecture was not. A figure concealed in a space where they should not be. A moment in which the concealment is about to resolve into danger. A warning that intervenes. A rescue that depends on the warning being understood and acted upon in time. These elements had been traveling together in various configurations across a very long span of human storytelling. There is something that happens when a researcher first locates a story they recognize, a story from their own life, from their mother or their neighbor or their college roommate, in a scholarly index that traces its components back through centuries and across continents. The feeling is not quite what one would expect. It is not deflating, not the feeling of discovering that something personal has been reduced to a number in a catalog. It is closer to the feeling of finding out that a river one swam in as a child connects, by way of channels one never thought to trace, to a much larger body of water than one had imagined. The story is still the story. The mother is still the mother who told it. The night drive that the warning was about is still the night drive, still real in whatever way the listener received it. And the story is also something else, a member of a very old and very widely distributed family of narratives, carrying in its structure something that people across many different circumstances have found it useful to carry. The chalkboard in the 1970s seminar room had the letters FOF at its center, and the student in the back row had recognized something. But the recognition she had in that moment was of a particular kind. It was the recognition of a mechanism, the moment when the gears of a clock become visible through an opening in its face, and one understands, suddenly, not just that the clock tells time, but something of how it does it. The story she had been told by her mother had traveled to her mother through a chain of exactly this structure, attributed to someone just beyond reach, close enough to feel verified, carrying in its three-act shape a warning that arrived as experience rather than advice. And the reason it had arrived that way, the reason it had been told rather than posted or printed or announced, was precisely that the telling was the technology. The story needed a voice. It needed the particular weight of someone who believed it, passing it to someone they cared about, in the register of a person sharing something true. Oral transmission of this kind operates according to principles that are different from the principles governing written or broadcast information. When a story moves from mouth to ear, and then, in time, from that ear to another mouth, it is not copied with the precision of a document, it is reconstructed. The teller retains what felt important and true, what carried the weight of the thing, and releases what seemed incidental. Details that do not serve the story's purpose drift away. Details that do serve the purpose are retained and sometimes intensified. Across many iterations of this reconstruction, a story converges on something close to its essential form. The elements that remain are the ones that have proven their usefulness to the telling over and over in the sorting process of transmission. What survives is not necessarily what happened. It is what works. The three-act structure of the backseat stranger legend, the woman driving alone, the strange behavior of the attendant, the revelation of the hidden figure, represents the story in what folklorists sometimes call its crystallized form, the version that transmission has refined to a kind of efficiency. Each element of that structure earns its place. The woman driving alone establishes a specific kind of vulnerability, a context of legitimate independence turned suddenly precarious. The attendant's strange behavior creates what narrative theory would recognize as dramatic irony. The listener, if they have heard the story, knows something the driver does not, and the tension of that gap is where the story's emotional work happens. The revelation resolves the irony and delivers the lesson simultaneously. None of these elements could easily be removed without damaging the story's ability to travel. The structure is not ornamental, it is load-bearing. Folklorists who have examined this crystallized form in detail have noted that the story contains, embedded in its structure, a specific and complete sequence of recommended behaviors. A woman driving alone at night should accept help from service industry workers who express urgent concern. A gas station or a parking lot attendant, or any figure encountered in a semi-public nocturnal context who seems to be trying to communicate something important, should be trusted rather than ignored. The story does not state these lessons, it dramatizes them. The driver who listens to the attendant is safe. The driver who might have dismissed the urgency, driven away, thought the attendant was being odd or invasive or presumptuous, would not have been. The lesson is in the plot, not in any announced moral. This is, Daig argued, precisely why the story works better than the lesson alone would. A thick reference volume, open to a page dense with small type, shows this kind of lesson appearing in tale traditions that are very old and geographically very distant from an American gas station in 1966. The Thompson Motif Index entry for deceptive concealment sits near entries about hidden figures and disguised identity, and the tale variants listed beside these entries come from places that were separated by oceans and centuries. The Grimm collection, medieval Latin manuscripts, oral traditions from West Africa and from rural Japan and from island communities in the Pacific. The specific figure hiding in the specific back seat of a specific American car is new. The underlying shape, someone is concealed in a space the protagonist believes is empty. Someone else knows. The knowing person must find a way to make the protagonist understand, is not new at all. It appears to be something that stories have been doing, in some form for a very long time. This is where the study of individual legends opens into something wider, and the opening is worth following for a moment. If the Backseat Stranger legend's core architecture appears independently across cultures that had no contact with each other, there are two broad possibilities. One is that the stories diffused from a common ancient source, spreading outward across human populations over centuries in the way that languages spread. The other is that the architecture of the story, the hidden figure, the warning, the rescue, maps onto something in human cognition that is consistent across cultures, a shared preoccupation that story traditions in many different places have independently found it useful to address. Most folklorists treat both possibilities as partially true. Stories travel, and they also arise. The particular anxiety of enclosed spaces, of spaces that seem private but might not be, appears to be something that human beings have found it worth telling stories about in many different times and places. In a photocopy of a bibliography pinned to a corkboard in a graduate student's office, this would be the mid-1970s. In a university folklore program, the kind of office where the corkboard was the most organized surface in the room, someone had drawn arrows in pen connecting 3 entries in a reading list. The hook was there, the vanishing hitchhiker was there, and the backseat stranger was there. The arrows between them formed a rough triangle, and next to the triangle someone had written, in the margins of the photocopy, a note in small handwriting, same car, different fear. It was the kind of marginal annotation that captures in 6 words what a paragraph might take longer to establish. Same side of the story, same object at the center, different aspect of the object's potential for danger. The cluster of roadway legends that occupied American oral tradition in the post-war decades was not 3 separate stories. It was, in some sense, 3 aspects of a single ongoing cultural conversation about what the automobile meant, about what it made possible, and about what it made possible for others. 2 neighbors stood at a backyard fence on a summer evening, the kind of evening that had settled into that particular warm stillness that late July produces in the Midwest, the air still carrying the afternoon's heat, the light going long and golden through the trees along the back of the yard. One of them was describing something, the other was listening with the posture of someone who had tilted slightly forward without realizing it. The story being told had come to the teller from her sister-in-law, who had heard it from a woman she worked with, who had a friend who had been driving home from a late shift and stopped at a gas station on the highway, and the attendant there had seen something in the car, had acted strangely, had asked the driver to come inside, and what he had seen was, the teller paused, not for effect, because she was not performing the story, she was reporting it. What he had seen was a man lying down in the back seat, behind the driver's seat, where you would never look. The woman listening did not ask for the name of the gas station. She did not ask which highway. She did not ask for the name of the driver, or the name of the attendant, or the date on which this had occurred. She accepted the attribution, her sister-in-law, a woman she worked with, a friend, as the structure that made the story trustworthy, not as a set of facts to be independently verified. This is not a failure of critical thinking. It is the ordinary operating mode of social information exchange, the mode that has allowed communities to share useful knowledge about the world across every era in which communities have existed. Not every important piece of information has a document attached to it. Not every useful warning comes from an institution with a letterhead. Some of the most durable and practically significant things a person learns about how to move through the world arrive in the voice of someone they trust, attributed to someone just beyond reach, in the backyard on a summer evening when the light is going long. The student who recognized her mother's story in the folklorist seminar 30 years later would have known that the attribution chain her mother used was the same chain that millions of other tellers had used. She would have known the story had a name in scholarly literature and an entry in an index and a place in a cluster of related legends that folklorists had been documenting for decades. She would have known that its core structure appeared in tale traditions that predate the automobile by centuries. And she would also have known, because she was a careful thinker who understood what the field had and had not established, that none of this settled the question of whether the story described something that could happen, or had happened, or was happening somewhere in the broad country beyond the particular telling. The legend's status as a legend did not make it impossible. It made it a story. Stories and possibilities are not the same category, and the field of folklore had been careful not to collapse them. What the field had established with considerable care was that the story moved because it was useful. It moved because the attribution structure made it feel true, because the three-act plot delivered a lesson without stating one, because the setting, the car, the night, the lone driver, the semi-public space of the gas station mapped precisely onto a set of genuine anxieties about genuine situations. The story did not need to have originated in a single confirmed event to do this work. It needed only to describe something that felt true enough to someone who heard it, true enough that they passed it to someone else, true enough that the someone else did the same. The truth that the story carried was not the truth of a police report. It was the truth of a community's felt sense of where the edges of safety were. A 1955 Chevrolet sat at a roadside rest area in the long gray light of an early autumn morning, its doors unlocked in the casual way that people left car doors unlocked in that era. The back seat visible through the rear window, the blue fabric, the curve of the seat back, the space below it that a determined examination might reveal and a casual glance would not. A family was out of the car, stretching, the children running in the grass beside the parking area, the adults standing with their coffee near the picnic table. Inside the car, the back seat was simply a back seat. No one was there. The car sat in the pale morning light, ordinary in every respect, the highway running beside it with its occasional traffic, and nothing was wrong. The story about what could be there was traveling anyway. It was in the mouth of someone telling a neighbor over a fence. It was in a letter someone was composing to a newspaper advice column, asking the columnist to please share this warning with every woman who reads you. It was in the memory of a student who had heard it from her mother and had not yet known it had a name. The car at the rest area would eventually be repacked with children and luggage and drive away, unremarkably safe, into the rest of the morning. And the story would continue its own travel, by its own means, finding the social networks that would carry it forward, arriving in new voices with new attributions, its structure intact, its warning delivered with the particular quiet urgency of something a person believes the listener genuinely needs to know. The Thompson motif index entry for deceptive concealment is a few lines of dense academic type, the motif number, the descriptive label, and then a list of tale sources from cultures across multiple continents and several centuries. The list is not long, but it is wide. It spans distances that no individual story could have traveled without help, distances that suggest either very ancient diffusion or independent convergence, or some combination of both that the record is not clear enough to sort out. The language of the entry is entirely matter of fact, the prose of a cataloger describing a pattern in data, hidden, concealed, discovers, warns, escapes, These are the verbs of the entry, and they are ancient verbs, worn smooth with use, the kind of verbs that turn up in the oldest stories in any tradition because they describe things that people in every tradition have found it necessary to describe. Sitting with that entry for a moment, in the quiet of a library, or in the half dark of a room at this hour, the mind follows the list of tale sources out across the map, stories from places that share no coastline and no language and no common history, carrying in their different clothing the same underlying architecture. Someone is where they should not be, someone else knows, and the knowing person must find a way, in time, to make the other person understand. The gas station attendant walking toward the car window, the neighbor lowering her voice over the fence, the folklorist chalk on the board. These are all, in some sense, the same gesture, the attempt to transmit urgent knowledge from one person to another, across the gap between what one person knows and what another person needs to know, before the moment passes when the knowing could still be useful. The student in the seminar room did not raise her hand and tell the folklorist that her mother had told her this story. That moment stayed private, the way recognitions often do. She wrote down the acronym in her notebook, the way students write down what is on the board, and she sat with the particular feeling of the thing having acquired a name. The name did not change the story. The story was still the one her mother had told her, still attributed to the friend of someone her mother knew, still carrying in its three-act structure the lesson that had settled into her behavior, so quietly she had never noticed it, arriving. The name simply told her that the story had been many other places before it arrived in her mother's telling, had passed through many other voices, had been recognized by scholars who found it interesting enough to examine carefully and catalog. It was a story with a history. It was a story with a lineage traceable back through the index of human tale-making to motifs so old and so widely distributed that their origin could no longer be located with any precision on any map. And the history of that story, its lineage through the index, its cluster of related automobile legends, its FOAF attribution chain, its work as a carrier of community safety knowledge in the absence of any institution that thought to formalize that knowledge, was itself a kind of story. Not a legend, not a cautionary tale, but a long and patient account of how a particular form of knowledge moves through a community, how it finds the voices that will carry it and the ears that will receive it, and the moments of quiet urgency in which it gets told. The folklorist with the chalk, the neighbor over the fence, the student with the notebook, the index with its dense and matter-of-fact entries reaching back through centuries into tale traditions from 4 continents. All of them were part of the same long movement of a story through time, each of them occupying one moment in a transit that had begun much earlier than any of them, and that in the way of stories that have found themselves useful would not be ending any time soon. The chalkboard letters settled into the quiet of the seminar room. Outside the window, the afternoon continued, unconcerned, and somewhere in the index among the entries for deceptive concealment in traditions from cultures that no longer exist in the forms they once had, the motif sat in its catalog entry with the patience of something very old and very widely distributed, waiting for the next researcher who would open the volume to that page, find the list of tale sources extending across multiple continents, and sit for a moment with the quiet wonder of discovering how far back and how wide the architecture of a single story can reach when the story turns out to describe something that people, across a very long span of time and a very wide geography, have found it worth their while to tell. A police records room is a quiet place. The overhead lights run on fluorescent tubes that produce a thin, even hum, and that hum fills the room at all hours because the lights are never turned off. The shelves run floor to ceiling in rows, and the rows hold manila folders in hanging files, and the hanging files are sorted by year and precinct and case number in sequences that go back decades. The folders themselves have a particular weight, not heavy, but substantial, the way a document feels when it contains a formal account of something that actually happened. The paper inside has been typed on standard government forms. The language on those forms is plain and specific: location, time, reporting officer, description of incident, and then, in the field marked narrative, whatever the responding officer chose to write down in the hours after they arrived at the scene and determined what had occurred. That kind of paperwork is not literature. It was not written to be read in an archive 60 years later by someone trying to understand the distance between a story people tell each other and a thing that happened. It was written to document, to close, to file. But what it contains, when read carefully, is a particular kind of evidence. Evidence of the kinds of things that actually happen in parking structures and residential driveways, in cities large enough to have records rooms that never empty and lights that never go off. The folders from Chicago in the 1980s are among the older ones. Chicago maintained its incident reports in a system that cross-referenced by location and crime type, and among the categories were cases involving unauthorized presence in or around private vehicles. Not all of those cases were violent. Some involved individuals sheltering in unlocked cars during cold weather. Some involved opportunistic theft that had gone wrong when the owner returned. A meaningful number, though, described something more deliberate: a person found inside a vehicle who had no reason to be there and who had not entered through any open door because the doors had been locked, and then, by means that the forensic notes sometimes described and sometimes did not, unlocked again from within. These folders did not use language like hiding or lying in wait. They used language like discovered concealed in the rear seating area or found behind the second row seats, but the meaning was the same in all of them. Los Angeles had its own version of this documentation. In a city built around the automobile, the parking structure had become a distinctive urban geography. Levels of concrete connected by ramps, lit by the same kind of fluorescent tubes as the records rooms, full of cars left unattended for hours at a stretch. The incident reports from parking structures in Los Angeles during the 1970s and 1980s recorded a consistent pattern. Vehicles entered, in the majority of documented cases, during daytime business hours, when activity in the structure was high enough that no single person entering or exiting drew sustained attention. The concealment, when it was documented, took advantage of the fact that the rear of most American cars of that era was a space that a person of average build could occupy without being visible through the exterior windows, particularly if the car had rear bench seating or a long cargo area. Detroit and Houston added their own versions of the same record to the national file. The cities were different in geography, in climate, in the texture of daily life, but the incident reports resembled each other in their essential structure: a vehicle, a parking area, an unauthorized occupant found in the rear. The reason for their presence, when the investigating officer was able to establish it, varied. The fact of their presence did not. None of this documentation says what the urban legend says it says. The legend has a specific architecture: a woman, a gas station, a warning, and that architecture does not appear wholesale in the incident reports. What the reports contain is a factual substrate, the raw material of documented occurrence that the legend both drew from and elaborated on. in the way that all cautionary narratives draw from and elaborate on the real conditions of the world they move through. The record and the story are not the same thing, but they are not entirely separate things either. In 1999, a case in Columbus, Ohio, moved through the criminal justice system and left behind a set of documents that were eventually cited in formal law enforcement communications. The setting was a shopping center, large, multi-level, busy during daytime hours, and progressively quieter as the evening approached. A woman parked her SUV there during the day. The vehicle was a dark color with tinted rear windows. She locked it and went inside. A male suspect, identified later through security camera footage, approached the vehicle after she had entered the building and gained access to the interior. He concealed himself in the rear cargo area, behind the folded-down rear seats, in a space that was not directly visible from the driver's seat, through the rear-view mirror. The suspect's intent, as established by the subsequent investigation, was to wait until the woman returned, remain concealed while she drove away from the parking area, and act once the vehicle was in motion and away from the populated shopping center. This detail, the waiting, the patience of it, the calculated use of the distance between a populated area and the isolation of a moving vehicle, is what distinguishes the case from opportunistic concealment. The plan required the suspect to remain completely still for an unknown period, potentially hours, in a small enclosed space. The woman returned to her vehicle that evening. She was alone. The documentation does not describe what she noticed or did not notice as she approached the car. What it records is that, for reasons that the incident report identifies but does not extensively narrate, she did not drive away from the parking area. Instead, she attracted the attention of a security patrol, and the suspect was found in the rear cargo space. He was arrested. The case produced formal documentation, the incident report, the arrest record, the subsequent court filings, and those documents were cited by Ohio law enforcement agencies in public safety materials issued in the following years. The materials advised women driving alone to check the rear seating area of their vehicles before entering. The language was practical and plain in the manner of safety advisories issued by institutions. What the 1999 Columbus case produced in its passage through the formal system was physical evidence. The forensic record of a hiding-in-vehicle case is specific and technical. Investigators who work vehicle concealment cases look for fingerprints on interior door panels, the places where a person adjusting their position in a confined space will brace themselves against the door. They examine the upholstery of rear seats for trace evidence, hair, fibers transferred from clothing, the kinds of impressions that a body makes in fabric when it has remained in contact with that fabric for an extended period. They look at the exterior lock mechanisms for tool marks or signs of forced entry. When a suspect has been inside a vehicle for hours, the evidence they leave behind is not subtle. Human contact with surfaces leaves traces even when the person making contact has no intention of being identified. This is one of the ways that a confirmed case is distinguishable from a circulating narrative. The narrative leaves no physical trace. It passes through a community and leaves behind, in the people who heard it, a residue of altered behavior, a habit of checking rear seats, a new awareness of parking structures. But the paper trail of the confirmed case is different in kind. The transparent tape lift pressed against rear seat upholstery, the entry in the evidence log, the case number typed at the top of the arrest record, these are not story, they are record. They exist in filing systems that do not change with repeated tellings. The FBI's national reporting systems do not maintain a category specific to hiding in vehicle attacks. The crime type does not appear in the National Incident-Based Reporting System as a discrete statistical entry. This is not because the incidents are too rare to record, but because the categorization system organizes crimes by their outcome and the relationship between offender and victim, rather than by the specific method of concealment or approach. A hiding in vehicle incident is recorded, depending on its outcome, under kidnapping, abduction, attempted assault, or a range of related categories. The broader data on kidnapping and abduction cases, drawn from federal statistics compiled across multiple years, shows a subset of cases in which the point of contact between offender and victim was the victim's own vehicle, cases in which the offender was either already inside the vehicle when the victim entered it, or approached the victim at or near the vehicle and used it as the site or instrument of the abduction. That subset is not small. It is large enough that it has informed law enforcement training materials, vehicle safety advisories, and the behavioral recommendations that consumer safety programs have distributed across several decades. The physical environments where documented vehicle concealment incidents tend to cluster are parking structures, large open parking lots associated with shopping centers or entertainment venues, and residential driveways. The shared characteristic of these environments is time. They are places where vehicles are left unattended for extended periods, long enough for concealment to occur, long enough for the person concealing themselves to wait without being noticed. A parking structure offers additional cover. The concrete levels limit sight lines. The vehicle density makes any single car difficult to monitor, and the noise of the structure, tires on concrete ramps, the distant sound of traffic above and below, provides a kind of acoustic cover for movement. These are the physical conditions that the incident reports describe, city after city, decade after decade, in the language of location, field, and time of incident. The FBI regional offices that produced crime prevention materials for community distribution during the 1980s and 1990s were drawing on this accumulated documentation when they included vehicle entry in their checklists of personal vulnerability moments. The checklist language was deliberately sparse. The items were numbered. The vehicle entry item read, in most versions, something close to check the rear seating area of your vehicle before entering, particularly in low visibility conditions. This language was specific and behavioral. It described an action a person could take in a moment that could be precisely identified at a particular point in their interaction with their own vehicle. It was derived from the pattern the incident reports established, that the rear seating area in low visibility conditions was the space where concealment had been documented to occur. The 2003 Georgia case is the one that among documented incidents most closely follows the three-part structure that had been circulating in oral tradition for nearly 40 years. The setting was a rural full-service gas station, one of the last remaining type in a region where self-service had become standard. The canopy lights over the pumps reflected off the damp concrete apron. The station was on a state highway. The attendant who worked that evening shift had worked the same shift for a long time and knew his customers by the sound of their engines and the way they pulled up to the pump. A woman driving a minivan stopped to fill her tank. She was traveling alone. The attendant came out to the vehicle, as was standard at a full-service station, and as he moved around the vehicle toward the fuel cap, something in the geometry of the back of the van caught his attention. The documentation does not specify what it was exactly, whether it was a slight shift of the vehicle's suspension, or a shape visible through the rear window, or simply something wrong in the quality of stillness inside the vehicle. What the report records is that he noticed. He noticed, and instead of proceeding immediately to fill the tank, he moved to the driver's window and spoke to the woman. He kept his voice low. He kept his eyes on the back of the vehicle while he spoke. The conversation, as reported, was brief. The woman, to her credit and the credit of whatever instinct or training or accumulated awareness she brought to that moment, did not react in any way visible to the interior of the van. She asked the attendant to call the police. He did. He moved back to the pump and went through the motions of preparing to fill the tank while the call was placed. The man found in the rear of the minivan was an adult male who had entered the vehicle while it was parked at a rest stop earlier in the woman's journey. The arrest record describes the circumstances of his entry and his concealment. The documentation records the outcome, the arrest, the charge, the processing through the criminal system. Regional news organizations in Georgia covered the story when it occurred because it was documentably true, and its structure was, to anyone who had ever heard the circulating legend, immediately recognizable. The coverage noted the parallel. Several of the news reports included language acknowledging that the scenario matched a widely known urban legend, and then proceeded to confirm that this particular instance had a police record attached to it. That moment, a news organization noting that a confirmed incident resembles a circulating legend is an interesting one, worth sitting with. It reveals something about the relationship between story and documentation that the records room does not fully resolve. A legend that has been circulating for 40 years, describing a scenario that law enforcement has documented across multiple jurisdictions, cannot be said to be purely fictional, nor can it be said to be a faithful account of any single documented event. What it is, instead, is a kind of distributed archive, a collection of cautionary knowledge about a category of documented risk, shaped into narrative form by decades of retelling and moving through communities in the only transmission format available to it: the spoken word, the forwarded letter, the second-hand account attributed to someone 2 social links away from the teller. The gap between the legend and the record is not the gap between the false and the true. It is a narrower and more interesting gap than that. The legend is not a documentary. The record is not a story. Both are attempting, in their different registers and by their different means, to account for a pattern that the evidence shows is real, that vehicles can be used as sites of concealment, that this has happened in parking structures in Columbus, and on rural highways in Georgia, and in residential driveways in cities whose incident reports are filed under years that go back further than most people would assume. The forensic evidence in confirmed cases is worth describing carefully, not because it is graphic, but because it is specific in a way that clarifies the nature of the documentation. The fingerprints on interior door panels in a vehicle concealment case are not always immediately visible. A latent print on a fabric surface, the kind of surface that makes up most of a car's interior, requires chemical treatment to develop. Investigators spray 9-hydrin or apply physical developer to the fabric, and the print, if present, emerges slowly over minutes or hours. The result is a mark that connects a specific person's hand to a specific surface inside a specific vehicle on a specific occasion. This is the nature of forensic documentation. It is not a story about what might have happened. It is a record of what the physical evidence shows did happen in the particular and the specific, connected to a case number that exists in a filing system somewhere. The trace hair and fiber evidence in a long-duration concealment case is similarly specific. A person who has remained in a confined space for hours leaves behind a quantity of transferred material, hairs shed naturally, fibers rubbed from clothing onto upholstery, the faint impression of contact in fabric that has been subjected to sustained pressure from a body weight. Forensic examiners who work these cases describe the evidence as consistent. The amount of transferred material increases with the duration of concealment, and in cases where the suspect had been inside the vehicle for several hours, the evidence is extensive enough that it can be used to reconstruct, in general terms, the position and duration of their presence. Tool marks on exterior lock mechanisms tell a different part of the story. Some vehicle concealment cases involve entry through an unlocked door, in which case there are no tool marks at all. Some involve entry methods that leave subtle marks on the keyway or the lock housing, marks that a forensic examiner can compare against known tool types to determine what was used. These marks are small, and they are found by examining the lock mechanism under magnification, but they are there if the entry was forced. They are another form of the paper trail, physical documentation of the moment of entry, written into the hardware of the vehicle itself. The FBI community outreach materials from the 1980s and 1990s were produced in the practical knowledge that this kind of evidence existed and that the scenarios it documented had geographic reach. The checklists and safety bulletins were not responding to the circulating legend. They were responding to the accumulated incident reports from their own field offices. That those reports described scenarios structurally similar to the legend was a function of the fact that both the legend and the reports were describing the same category of actual documented risk from different angles and in different registers. The parking lot at night is a specific environment. Under sodium vapor lights of the older type, color perception is reduced. The orange cast of the lights flattens the visual field, makes it harder to see clearly into the interior of a vehicle from a distance. Newer LED parking lot lighting is better in this regard, but the documented cases in the records from the 1970s and 1980s occurred under the older lighting conditions. The forensic reports note lighting conditions when they are relevant, and in cases where the victim approached a vehicle in a dimly lit or oddly lit environment, the lighting conditions are part of the contextual record. A shopping center parking lot closing for the night, its anchor store's windows going dark from the inside in sections as staff completed their closing work, is a transitional environment. During peak hours, it is populated enough that no individual can remain unobserved for long. As the evening progresses, the population thins. By the time the last stores are closed and the last employees have walked to their cars in clusters, the lot is quiet. The incident reports from these environments cluster in the late evening and early night hours. This is not a point of interpretation. It is what the time fields on the forms show. None of this resolves the question of the legend's literal truth, because that question is not the right question. No single documented case is the origin point of the circulating narrative. The narrative did not emerge from a specific incident and then spread outward from it. It emerged from the general conditions, the documented pattern of risk, the physical characteristics of the automobile, the particular vulnerability of the parking structure at night, and it found its form through the process of repeated telling and retelling, each teller shaping the scenario slightly to fit the geography and the anxiety of their own community. The documented cases sit alongside the legend without being the legend. They are the factual landscape the story moves through. The Georgia attendant in 2003 was not acting out a myth. He was a man who worked a full-service gas station on a rural state highway and who noticed something wrong in the back of a customer's vehicle on a damp night when the canopy lights were reflecting off the concrete apron. He moved to the driver's window. He kept his voice quiet. He kept his eyes on the back of the van while he spoke, because whatever he had seen or sensed in the vehicle was still there, and he understood that moment, a man standing at a car window in the dark, speaking quietly, his eyes on the back of the vehicle, is documented. It is in the arrest record and the news archive. It happened at a specific location at a specific time, and the result of it is recorded in a criminal case file that exists in a Georgia courthouse. It is not a legend, it is a fact. And it is, in its structure and its geography and its cast of characters, almost exactly the story that had been circulating through American communities since the early 1960s. The line between story and record is not always where it seems to be. In most cases, the line is clear. The incident reports and the forensic documentation exist in a different register entirely from the oral narrative, and the differences between them are meaningful and real. The legend is not a single historical event. The confirmed cases are not confirmation of the legend. They are separate things with a genuine and interesting relationship, a relationship that the records room and the archive both preserve in their different ways in the same persistent quiet. The woman in the Georgia minivan drove away from the gas station that night in a vehicle that had been searched and cleared. The man who had concealed himself in the rear of it was in custody. The attendant, presumably, finished his shift. The damp concrete apron caught the reflection of the canopy lights for the rest of the night, as it would the next night and the night after that, and the vehicles that stopped to fill their tanks pulled in and pulled out on the ordinary business of traveling from one place to another on a rural state highway, their rear seats empty and unremarkable and lit when anyone looked in the orange cast of the overhead light. The records that document what happened in Columbus and in Chicago and in the Georgia station are filed under case numbers. They are accessible in the ways that public records are accessible. They are not stories, but they carry within them something that stories also carry, a specific human moment, preserved in the particular and the concrete, waiting in a folder in a records room that is always lit, its fluorescent hum filling the quiet between the rows. A brain scan image from a research paper has a particular quality of light. The tissue appears dark, almost uniform, and then one region catches the eye, a warm bloom of color, amber and orange, sitting near the center of the image like an ember in a cold room. The clinical notations in the margin are small and precise. The caption reads, in the dry language of published research, amygdala activation during presentation of threat stimuli from posterior visual field. The laboratory where this image was produced was quiet and carefully lit. The equipment was expensive and the methodology was sound, and what the image recorded in its careful scientific way was something that has been running in the human brain for a very long time. The amygdala is a small structure, roughly almond-shaped, sitting deep inside each hemisphere of the brain. Its role in threat detection has been studied extensively since the mid-20th century, and what decades of accumulated research have established is that it does not wait to be instructed. When a stimulus associated with danger appears, a sudden movement, a shadow, a sound from behind, the amygdala responds before conscious awareness has had time to form a thought about it. The response is fast. It is largely automatic, and it is, in the view of most researchers who have spent time examining it, extremely old. The warmth of that color in the scan is not drama. It is simply a record of something working as it was built to work in a modern university laboratory, in a brain that has been carrying this mechanism across a very long time. Arne Ohman, a psychologist at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, spent much of his career studying the specific geometry of threat response, not simply whether threat is detected, but from where. His research and the research it prompted established something that is, once stated, intuitively obvious, though the obviousness does not diminish how interesting it is. The brain's alarm systems respond more intensely and more rapidly to threats that appear from behind the observer or from below the line of sight than to identical threats appearing from within the forward visual field. A sound from behind activates a different quality of attention than the same sound from in front. A movement at the periphery draws a different response than a movement directly ahead. The geometry matters, and the reason the geometry matters reaches back considerably further than the automobile, or the parking garage, or the regional newspaper advisory column. In a quiet Karolinska laboratory in the 1990s, a participant seated at a desk reported, calmly, into a small microphone clipped near their collar, that a soft sound made behind them had felt louder than an identical sound produced in front. The physical volume was the same. The measurement equipment confirmed this. The felt intensity was not. What the participant was reporting was not confusion. It was the precise operation of a nervous system calibrated for a world in which things approaching from behind, outside the visual field, were considerably more likely to be dangerous than things arriving from the front, where they could be seen and evaluated in time to respond. This is not a human idiosyncrasy. The same posterior threat sensitivity appears across a broad range of vertebrate species. It is old enough and consistent enough across the animal kingdom that its presence in humans is generally understood as inheritance rather than invention. What is interesting in the context of a particular story that has circulated in American culture since at least the late 1950s is how precisely the story's central image maps onto this ancient sensitivity. A car's back seat is behind the driver. In the rearview mirror, it appears as a dark rectangle, visible enough to register, but too compressed and shadowed for confident assessment. The mirror shows what is there, only obliquely. The driver's head would have to turn, requiring a deliberate act to bring the back seat into full view. And a person lying low across that back seat, crouched against the upholstery, pressed behind the front seats, would in many vehicles be nearly invisible in the mirror even at close range. The legend's image is not constructed from thin air. It is constructed from the exact geometry that the brain has been trained, across a very long period, to find most alarming. Pascal Boyer, a cognitive anthropologist whose work has examined the structural features of stories that spread widely across cultures, has argued that narratives involving hidden agents, concealed figures, unseen presences, beings positioned outside the observer's immediate awareness, are cross-culturally prevalent, not by accident, but because they trigger cognitive systems that have been, for a very long time, extremely useful. The detection of hidden agents mattered. An environment scanned only for visible, announced threats was an environment in which certain categories of danger went undetected until too late. The cognitive module that runs a constant low-level search for concealed presences, for signs that something might be somewhere it has not declared itself, this module, Boyer's research suggests, is part of the standard human cognitive equipment. It runs whether or not there is anything there to detect, and stories that activate it travel well across cultures and across time because they are built to fit the machinery that receives them. The Backseat Stranger story fits this machinery with a particular neatness. The hidden figure is positioned behind the protagonist. The danger goes undetected through the ordinary course of the journey. The protagonist is enclosed in a small space, moving through a larger world, without knowing that the threat is. Boyer would recognize this structure immediately. It touches what his research describes as a hyperactive agency detection system, the brain's tendency to err on the side of finding agents, of locating presences, even when the evidence is ambiguous. A shadow becomes a figure, a creak becomes a footstep, a movement in the rearview mirror, if the light is wrong and the hour is late, becomes something worth looking at again. The interior of a car at night meets the conditions that psychological research has identified as reliably producing elevated baseline anxiety. A study published in the journal Anxiety, Stress, and Coping found that individuals traveling alone in vehicles at night reported significantly higher anxiety than the same individuals traveling in daylight or traveling with others in the same conditions. The effect was not small, and the researchers noted that the elevated anxiety was present even on familiar routes, even in vehicles the participants had driven for years, even when nothing in the environment had given any indication of danger. The nighttime enclosure itself was enough. The being alone was enough. The conditions, held together, produced a measurable response in the absence of any specific trigger. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A familiar car, a known road, a routine drive, and the body still registers something that reads as heightened alertness. Not fear. Exactly. Not the acute activation recorded in Uthman's posterior threat experiments, but a baseline elevation that the researchers described as consistent with mild environmental threat assessment. The body doing, quietly and without announcement, what it does in spaces where the edges of safety are not entirely certain. The car, as an environment, has particular properties that the psychological literature on situational anxiety has examined carefully. It is small. The doors require deliberate action to open. They do not simply give way. In a moving vehicle, exit is not immediately available at all. The physics of the situation defer departure to a moment when the vehicle has stopped and the door has been worked. These properties correspond closely to what clinical literature describes as a mildly claustrophobic environment, bounded, requiring intentional effort to leave, with limited options for rapid response to an unexpected interior event. The car is not a trap in any useful practical sense under ordinary circumstances, but it has the structural properties of a space in which the body notices, without being told, that options are somewhat constrained. In the dark of the back seat, behind the driver's head, behind the visual field, behind the rearview mirror's compressed and oblique reflection, these properties become more apparent. The story knows this. The story has always known this, in the way that stories know things, not through analysis but through the accumulated weight of many tellings, each one selecting for the details that land most deeply and discarding the ones that don't. What remained, after decades of retelling, was the detail that works, the back seat, specifically, not the trunk, not the passenger seat, the back seat, behind the driver's head, in the exact position the brain has been monitoring, with low-level and largely unconscious attention, for as long as there have been places to crouch and ambush from. There is a well-established branch of cognitive science that studies what happens to stories in transmission, how they change, which elements survive, which drop away. The researcher Frederick Bartlett, working in the early decades of the 20th century, demonstrated through careful experiment that when people retell stories, they do not reproduce them accurately. They reproduce the parts that connected with something existing in their cognitive or emotional architecture. The parts that found no hook in the receiving mind tended to fade. The parts that activated something, a known fear, a recognized structure, a felt image, tended to persist and sometimes to become more vivid with each successive telling. Bartlett called this process effort after meaning. What it produces, over many cycles of transmission is a story shaped by the minds that carried it, worn smooth in the places that matter, sharpened in the places that cut. The Backseat Stranger story, across 60 plus years of transmission, has been shaped this way. The details that survived are not random. The woman driving alone, the late hour, the enclosed car, the hidden figure behind her, the warning from an outside source, someone who could see what she couldn't. These elements are not present in every version of the story because they are narratively tidy. They are present in every version because they connected every time with something real in the mind receiving them. Bartlett's transmission filter applied itself, story by story, teller by teller, and what passed through was what fit. Psychological research on the relationship between stories and behavioral change has produced findings that are, in their quiet way, quite striking. A 2008 study published in the Journal of Health Communication examined how people receive and act on personal safety information, depending on the format in which it is delivered. Participants who received a safety warning in narrative form, the structure of a story, with a protagonist and a situation and a resolution, were substantially more likely to have adopted recommended protective behaviors 1 month later than participants who received the identical information as factual statistics or formal advisories. The effect was not marginal. It was large enough that the researchers described narrative format as significantly more effective than factual format for producing lasting behavioral change in the area of personal safety. This finding helps explain something that might otherwise seem like a curiosity, that a story widely known to be, in some meaningful sense, not literally true, has nevertheless produced genuine lasting changes in the behavior of people who heard it. The woman who heard the Backseat Stranger story from her college roommate in 1987, told as a warning, framed as something that happened to a friend of a friend, offered in the specific register of a story that is meant to be useful rather than merely interesting, that woman, 30 years later, pauses before opening her car door in a parking garage. She glances into the back seat. She has done this, probably thousands of times since 1987. She may not consciously connect the habit to the story anymore. The story has dissolved into the habit, which is a thing the story can do that a printed safety pamphlet generally cannot. The behavioral residue of the narrative format is longer and more durable than the behavioral residue of the factual format. The Journal of Health Communication researchers speculated about why this might be, and their speculation touched on several things. That narrative activates identification in a way that statistics do not. That a story's protagonist becomes a proxy self, whose experience is processed differently than someone else's data. That the emotional engagement of a story creates stronger memory encoding than the cognitive engagement of a fact. What they did not need to speculate about was the outcome. The outcome was in the data. The story worked better. The story kept working longer. It is worth understanding what this means for the Backseat Stranger legend specifically. The story is not simply a piece of folklore that people find interesting and then forget. It is a narrative that, in the terms of the research, performs a behavioral function. It installs a habit, and it installs that habit far more efficiently than any number of police department safety bulletins or crime prevention pamphlets could manage, because it arrives in the emotional register of something real, something that happened, to someone who knew someone, on a road not entirely unlike the road the listener herself drives. Cognitive anthropologists work on what makes fear narratives transmissible across cultures has pointed repeatedly to a particular combination of features: hidden agents, enclosed spaces, the failure of ordinary protective boundaries, and a resolution that comes from outside the protagonist's own awareness. The story does not end because the protagonist detected the threat herself. It ends because someone else saw it. The protagonist was, for the duration of the drive, genuinely unaware. This is not a detail that reduces the story's impact. It is the detail that makes the story's instruction most pointed. The hidden threat cannot be detected from inside. You need an outside eye. The gas station attendant, the person who can see what you cannot see from where you are sitting. Uman's work on posterior threat, Boyer's work on hidden agents, the research on narrative and behavioral change, the psychological literature on enclosed space anxiety. These bodies of research emerged independently from different academic traditions, examining different questions. They do not cite each other as influences, and yet they converge from different directions on a description of the human cognitive situation that the Backseat Stranger story appears to have located through entirely different means, through the accumulated pressure of oral transmission, through the selection process of many retellings, through the Bartlett filter of what survives in a human mind, because it fits what is already there. The story found the geometry of posterior threat without reading Overman. It found the activation pathway of hidden agent detection without reading Boyer. It found the narrative format's superiority for behavioral change without reading the Journal of Health Communication. It found these things the way folklore finds things, by circulating through enough minds, being tested against enough nervous systems, until what remained was the version that worked. There is a particular quality to the cognitive experience of sitting alone in a car at night with the engine off. The silence is not complete. There are small sounds the car makes as it settles, traffic at some distance, the ambient sound of wherever it is parked. But the bounded quiet of the car's interior creates a kind of acoustic enclosure that is different from open air. Sounds from inside the vehicle are registered differently than sounds from outside. The boundary of the car's body creates a perceptual frame, inside and outside. And in this bounded quiet, the rearview mirror offers its small compressed view of the back seat, available but not quite adequate, not quite reassuring in the way that turning fully around would be reassuring. The mirror shows the back seat as a rectangle of dimmer light, its details dependent on the light conditions outside, its distance reduced and its proportions slightly warped by the convex surface of the glass. Research participants asked to sit alone in a parked car at night in an empty lot and simply wait for 5 minutes showed measurable physiological signs of elevated alertness. Their heart rates increased slightly. Their skin conductance, a measure associated with sympathetic nervous system activation, was higher than baseline. They reported, afterward, filling out rating scales in a brightly lit room, that the experience had not been frightening, exactly, but that they had been aware, in a way they were not usually aware, of the space behind them. Several mentioned the rearview mirror. Several described a sense of the back seat as somehow present in their attention in a way that the passenger seat beside them was not. The geometry of where the attention went, under mild alertness in an enclosed space at night, was consistent with what Oman's work on posterior threat would predict. The Backseat Stranger story arrives into this attentional landscape and finds it already prepared. The story does not need to create the sensitivity to the back seat. The sensitivity is already running. What the story does is name it, give it a concrete image, and attach a behavioral recommendation to it. Look before you get in. And the brain, which has been intermittently looking for exactly the reason the story specifies, because it has been designed over a very long period to look in that direction, receives the instruction, and files it where it will be accessed again. The next time the listener parks in an unfamiliar lot at dusk, the next time the lighting is poor and the hour is later than usual, the story runs its quiet program. Boyer's research used the term cognitive modules to describe the specialized processing systems that handle particular categories of information: threat detection, social monitoring, the assessment of hidden intent. These modules do not require instruction to operate. They are running as background processes, and the content that activates them most reliably is not abstract argument, but concrete, vivid, emotionally engaged narrative, the kind of narrative that places the listener inside a situation and allows the modules to run their threat assessment as though the situation were real. The brain does not fully distinguish at the level of the amygdala between a story about a threat and an actual threat. The story produces a version of the same response, attenuated, felt at the level of engagement rather than emergency, and that attenuated response is enough to install the habit. The slight quickening, the glance toward the back seat, the moment of checking before settling in. This is not irrational. The psychological literature on protective behaviors is careful to note that habits formed through narrative engagement tend to be both more durable and more contextually appropriate than habits formed through deliberate rational decision-making. The rational decision, I should check my back seat, because occasionally this represents a real risk, requires retrieval, evaluation, and effortful application at each relevant moment. The habit formed through narrative engagement does not require any of this. It simply runs at the relevant moment, because the relevant moment matches the pattern the story installed. The woman in the parking garage in 2017, who pauses before opening her door, is not retrieving a logical argument. She is not calculating risk probabilities. She is doing something far more automatic and far more efficient than either of those things. A story she heard decades ago recognized a moment and ran its program. The check happens before she has consciously decided to make it. The story has, in the terms of the research, become a procedural habit rather than a declarative memory. There is something in this worth noticing in the particular quiet of a late hour, when the mind is moving toward the slower thoughts that come before sleep. The backseat stranger story is frightening, in a mild way, in its telling, but what it produces in the long term is not heightened fear. What it produces is a specific, targeted, largely unconscious protective behavior that operates at the exact moment it is needed and nowhere else. The story does not make people generally afraid of cars. It does not produce driving anxiety or reluctance to travel alone. It produces one thing, a glance into the back seat before settling in, and then it falls silent and lets the drive proceed. This is, in the terms of the research on cautionary narratives, an extraordinarily well-calibrated piece of community safety technology. Not designed, the word would be wrong for something that emerged from many mouths and many tellings, shaped by collective transmission rather than individual intention. Arrived at, the way water arrives at the path of least resistance, not by planning, but by pressure, by the accumulated weight of what works. A man's amygdala experiments, Boyer's hidden agent research, the Journal of Health Communications, narrative versus statistics findings, Bartlett's work on how stories are shaped by the minds that carry them. Each of these bodies of work describes one part of a system. The brain is old, and it was built for an environment that is not quite the contemporary one, and it carries forward its ancient sensitivities into situations that are new. A car is new in evolutionary terms. The back seat is new, but the darkness behind the observer, outside the visual field, below the reliable line of sight, that is not new. The brain's response to it is not new. And the story that found its way to that response, that learned over many decades of transmission to sit exactly in the space where the brain was already paying attention, that story arrived, as it has always arrived, at exactly the right address. The warm color in the brain scan image, the amber glow of the amygdala doing its old work in a modern laboratory, represents something that does not require explanation to be felt. The researcher in the margin made her clinical notations. The equipment recorded its measurements. And in the dark of the back seat, in the compressed rectangle of the rearview mirror, in the particular silence of a car parked alone in a lot after dark, the same thing is happening that has always happened. The brain is paying attention to the space behind it, because paying attention to the space behind it has for a very long time been useful. The story knows where to live. It has always known. The address was old before the automobile existed, old before the paved road, old before the lamp that flickers on as the last car pulls away and leaves the lot to its own quiet and its own long shadows. And the woman who pauses, hand on the door handle, breath slightly held, eyes moving to the back seat for just a moment before she gets in, is not performing caution. She is not following a rule she consciously remembers. She is simply doing what the brain does, in the moment the brain does it, in the space the story prepared, decades ago, with one particular image pressed gently into place. The back seat was empty. It almost always is. She knew it was likely to be empty before she looked. She looked anyway, the way the brain looks into the dark behind itself, when the hour is late and the lot is quiet and the old machinery runs its old check in the background of everything else. The check takes a moment. The story that installed it took even less than that. The first time she heard it, a roommate, a winter evening, a warning offered with the particular weight of something that felt like it had happened recently, and close. The story did its work that evening, and then it settled, and the habit remained, and 30 years went by, and it ran again. That is a long time for a story to keep its address, but the address was never going to move. The warmth of the amygdala in the scan, the soft amber against the surrounding dark, records something that was always going to be there, waiting for the story that knew how to find it, and now, quietly and without announcement, keeping its own kind of watch. A television news studio in 1979 had a particular quality of light. The Klieg lamps ran hot overhead, bleaching the anchor desk to a flat, even brightness that made everything look slightly more authoritative than it was. The camera was large, shoulder-mounted, and the operator stood behind it with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned not to move unnecessarily. The anchor's blazer had wide lapels, as all blazers did that year, and he held his script pages at a slight angle so the light would not create a glare that the camera would catch. Somewhere in the control room, a producer was counting down on fingers. When the segment began, the anchor read from copy that had arrived on his desk that afternoon. A safety advisory, the copy said, a concern that police were sharing with the public. The language was careful in the way that language is careful when it is not entirely sure what it is describing. Passive constructions, unspecified sources, the phrase area authorities. The chyron that appeared beneath his face read, "Women warned," in the large sans serif capitals that television used for things it wanted to seem urgent. In the story he read, with his careful studio diction, was the backseat stranger story. A woman alone in a car. A figure discovered hiding. A warning issued just in time. The broadcast lasted perhaps 90 seconds. It traveled outward from the transmitter in all directions at once. arriving simultaneously in several thousand living rooms across a viewing area that covered 3 counties. In those living rooms, people were doing the things people do during the evening news, folding laundry, half watching from the kitchen, sitting in armchairs with the sound slightly lower than intended. And the story arrived into all of those rooms at exactly the same moment, wearing the clothing of a police advisory, spoken in the measured voice of a man whose job was to relay verified information. It did not arrive as a story, it arrived as a fact. This distinction mattered, and the people who study how information moves through communities have spent considerable time thinking about what it meant. Media scholars who examined local television news from the 1970s and 1980s found a consistent pattern in the way consumer safety segments were constructed during this period. A story would circulate in a community by word of mouth, attributed to friends of friends, carrying the warm but unverifiable authority of personal connection. And then, at some point, the story would reach a local news producer by way of a viewer tip, or a community bulletin board, or a police public affairs officer who had himself heard it from a resident, and the producer would assign it as a safety segment. The segment would then be written and aired without a specific verified incident attached to it, but framed in the language of police advisories and community warnings. The story had moved from oral circulation to broadcast, and in making that move, it had acquired something new, the appearance of institutional confirmation. The anchor finished reading. The camera cut to the next story, and in the living rooms across 3 counties, the people who had half heard the segment went back to their laundry, their dinner, their conversations, but some of them had heard it. And of those who heard it, some of them would, in the following days, mention it to someone else, not as something they saw on the news necessarily, but as something they'd heard, something going around, something a person ought to know about. Jan Harold Brunvand, the folklorist who had spent years collecting these stories and tracing their paths through American culture, noticed what television was doing to the legend quite early. He documented not only the broadcast segments, but the print column appearances that ran alongside them, and of these the most significant were the syndicated advice columns. Both the Dear Abby column and the Ann Landers column published versions of the Backseat Stranger warning during the 1970s and 1980s, responding to reader letters that asked the columnist to please share this important information with as many people as possible. The columns had a combined readership that ran into the tens of millions. When a warning appeared in Dear Abby or Ann Landers, it arrived not in the living rooms of 3 counties, but in the kitchen tables and breakfast nooks of a substantial fraction of the literate American adult population. On the same morning, folded into the same newspaper between the crossword and the comics, a reader's letter, reprinted in smaller typeface beneath the columnist's response, asked, in the earnest, slightly urgent register that reader letters always carry, that the columnist share this warning with every woman who reads you. The handwritten original of that letter existed somewhere in an archive. The words in it were written by one person at one desk, probably on an ordinary evening, and then those words traveled outward into 12 million households over coffee and orange juice, landing with the authority of a trusted household institution, a column that had been running longer than many of its readers had been alive, a column that was understood to care, specifically, about the safety and well-being of its audience. Brunvand noted the particular effect this produced with the careful interest of someone watching a natural process at work. The legend had managed something that most oral traditions cannot achieve. It had found institutional amplification without requiring institutional verification, without requiring institutional verification. The columns did not claim to have confirmed the story. They passed it along as something their readers were reporting, something that concerned people were sharing with each other, something that, true or not, contained an implicit safety instruction that seemed worth relaying. And in passing it along, they gave it a new kind of weight. By the late 1990s, the story had found its way into another medium altogether, and in this new medium it found something it had always been missing: the ability to reach into households where the television set was off and the newspaper had already been read. The medium was the desktop computer. The modem was a device that connected through a telephone line with a sequence of rising and falling tones that anyone who had one remembered years later as one of the most recognizable sounds of that decade. When the connection finished, text would appear, line by line, green or amber against a dark screen, arriving from somewhere else. In 1996, in a college dormitory room on an ordinary weeknight, a Usenet thread was loading. The connection was slow, as connections were slow then, and the text appeared in segments rather than all at once, so a person reading it experienced the message as a kind of gradual arrival. The subject line, when it had fully loaded, read something to the effect of "Please forward this warning to every woman you know." The body of the message contained the Backseat stranger story. It was attributed, as it had always been attributed, to someone at a slight social distance, a friend's coworker, a relative in another city, someone whose identity was close enough to feel credible and distant enough to be unverifiable. But now the message contained something the oral version had never been able to carry: a direct and explicit instruction to transmit, "Please forward this to every woman you know." The instruction did something important to the story's transmission logic. When a story travels by word of mouth, the decision to pass it on is private and informal. A person mentions it because it seems worth mentioning in the context of a conversation that was already happening. The forwarding instruction made transmission a moral act. To read this warning and not pass it on was, the message implied, to fail the women in one's social network. To forward it was to perform a small act of protective community care, and so people forwarded it, in substantial numbers, to their contact lists, which were much smaller then than they would eventually become, but were already large enough to move a message across a city in an afternoon. Barbara and David Mickelson founded Snopes, Bedtime in the mid-1990s as a place to investigate exactly these circulating stories, to examine their origins, trace their transmission history, and report what could and could not be confirmed. In the late 1990s, as chain email was reaching its peak velocity, as a medium, the Backseat stranger story became one of the most frequently submitted items they received for verification. Dozens of distinct variants arrived in their submissions, different cities named, different vehicles described, different details about the gas station attendant, or the parking lot, or the moment of discovery, but all of them carrying the same structural core. The Mickelsons cataloged the variants with the patience that this kind of work requires, noting where they converged and where they diverged, what could be traced to a specific documented incident and what could not. Their conclusion was consistent across every variant. The story was a legend, old and widely circulated, and no specific confirmed incident could be found at its origin. That finding did not slow the story's movement. This was something the Mickelsons and the researchers who followed their work came to understand clearly. Verification is not the mechanism by which these stories travel. The story did not spread because people had confirmed it. It spread because it carried something that confirmation was not required to deliver: a feeling of useful knowledge, a sense of protective community, the specific satisfaction of having warned someone you care about before something could happen to them. The fact-checking site could tell its readers that the story was a legend, and many readers accepted this, and those same readers would, in the same parking lot 6 months later, still glance into the back seat before they got into the car. The film industry had also found uses for the legend, and had been finding them since well before the internet arrived to accelerate the story's movement. The 1998 horror film Urban Legend drew directly and explicitly on the tradition, including a sequence built around the canonical backseat scenario: the car, the darkness, the figure hidden below the line of sight in the mirror. The film arrived in video stores shortly after its theatrical release, and a person browsing in 1999 could find it on the shelf in its rental case, the cover art showing a silhouette inside a vehicle, the story having been returned in vivid, amplified, cinematically scored form to a generation of teenagers who had not yet heard it from their mothers. Anthology television had been doing similar work for years before the film. Programs that revisited the legend tradition found in the backseat scenario, a plot structure that adapted naturally to the short form. The setup was quick, the revelation was specific, the emotional register was already primed in the audience. A viewer who had heard the story before recognized its architecture arriving and felt a particular kind of anticipation that was different from ordinary surprise, something more like the recognition of a familiar piece of music, the pleasure of knowing what is coming while still being moved by the arrival. And a viewer who had never heard it was encountering it for the first time in its most emotionally intensified form, in a medium designed to make feelings large. This is part of what made the story so durable across so many transmission environments. It did not require a stable medium. It moved through word of mouth for decades, then found print columns and local television, then found chain email and Usenet, then found social media. Each environment received it and passed it on in the format that environment was best equipped to carry. And in each new format, the story found new audiences who had not yet heard it. The core, the woman, the car, the hidden figure, the warning remained consistent through every translation. The surrounding details shifted to match whatever geography, whatever technology, whatever social anxieties the new environment contained. By 2019, the environment in which the story traveled most efficiently was the smartphone notification. A post would appear in a local Facebook community group, tagged with the name of a specific shopping center, located at a specific intersection, in a specific suburb, and in the body of the post, the backseat stranger story would appear, updated to include the name of that shopping center, that suburb, that intersection. The specificity of the location made the story feel urgent in a way that generalized warnings could not. This was not a warning about cars in general. This was a warning about the parking structure at the mall 3 miles from here, the one you went to last Saturday, the one where you left your car on level 2 near the stairwell. The post would be shared hundreds of times in the first few hours, moving through the networks of a specific community at the speed that smartphone notifications move, arriving with a local address attached to a story that was more than 60 years old. Researchers from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism identified the backseat stranger story in a 2017 study as a prototypical example of what they called legacy misinformation, a category of content that had originated before the internet existed and that had found repeated new viral life on social platforms, carried forward each time by the specific features of the platform it was moving through. On social media, those features included algorithmic preferences for content that generated strong emotional responses, The ease with which a post could be shared to a specific geographic community, and the way that location tagging could give a decades-old story the appearance of a fresh local incident. The story had, in other words, been a highly adapted traveler for its entire existence. And when social media arrived with its particular geography and its particular logic, the story found it a congenial place to move. What the Reuters researchers were documenting, without quite framing it this way, was the story's capacity for what might be called environmental mimicry, its ability to take on the coloration of whatever medium it currently occupied. In the 1960s, it sounded like a community safety advisory in a regional newspaper, because regional newspapers were the medium through which the community shared safety information. In the 1970s, it sounded like a police warning read by a television anchor, because local news was the medium through which official warnings arrived. In the 1980s, it sounded like a concerned neighbor's letter, published in a trusted advice column, because that was how women shared protective information with other women across distances too large for conversation. In the 1990s, it sounded like a chain email with a forwarding instruction, because chain email was the medium through which urgent community warnings moved. In the 2010, it sounded like a Facebook post from a local group, because local Facebook groups were where communities discussed threats to their members. The story did not change its content to inhabit each of these environments. It changed its framing, its attributed source, its geographic specificity. The three-act core remained fixed: a woman alone, a danger concealed, a warning delivered at the last possible moment. That architecture had been stable since at least the early 1960s, and probably longer, and no amount of transmission had worn it away. Each new environment had found in that architecture something it could carry, something its audience would receive, something that would move. A woman reading the 1979 news broadcast was not, in the technical folkloristic sense, being told a story. She was receiving a police advisory. A woman reading the Ann Landers column was not being entertained. She was reading a public health notice from a trusted figure. A woman forwarding the 1996 chain email was not performing an act of storytelling. She was fulfilling a moral obligation to protect the people in her network. And yet the woman in 1979, and the woman reading Ann Landers, and the woman who hit forward on her email client were all transmitting the same story in different clothes, carrying the same structure it had always carried towards someone who had not yet received it. The story's ability to present itself as something other than a story was not incidental to its persistence. It was central to it. A story that announces itself as a story invites the listener to treat it as fiction, to evaluate it aesthetically, to hold it at the comfortable distance of a narrative. A story that arrives as a police advisory, or a trusted column, or a forwarded warning from a friend, asks to be received differently, as information, as something actionable, as something that has a claim on behavior. The Backseat Stranger story spent most of its existence making exactly that claim, and it was received that way by most of the people who encountered it in most of the media it traveled through. Jan Harold Brunvand, when he wrote about the story in the early 1980s, was working from a collection of oral variants gathered from informants across many states, and from the newspaper appearances he had been able to locate in regional archives. He did not have chain email. He did not have social media. He could not have predicted the speed at which the story would eventually be able to move, or the precision with which it would eventually be able to name local addresses. But the structural pattern he documented in those index cards, laid out across the reading table in Salt Lake City, is the same pattern that a researcher examining a 2019 Facebook post would find when they stripped away the tagged location and the smartphone interface and the particular anxieties of that year. Same warning, same figure, same car. There is something worth staying with in that particular continuity. Not because it is ominous, but because it is, in its way, a clear view of what a story actually is and what it actually does. The Backseat Stranger story is not a piece of information that people have been mistakenly passing around as true for 6 decades. It is a structure, a way of organizing fear and warning and community care into a form that can move from person to person, from medium to medium, from decade to decade, without losing its essential shape. Every medium it entered found it useful. Every audience it reached received it as something relevant to their lives. The story did not survive for 60 years because people were naive or careless or easily fooled. It survived because it was doing something for the people who carried it, something that safety pamphlets and statistics and verified incident reports could not do as efficiently or as memorably. The 2017 Reuters study noted, with the slightly weary precision of researchers who had seen this particular dynamic many times, that the story's social media variants consistently outperformed in engagement the corrections that followed them. A local Facebook post reporting a specific backseat stranger incident at a named shopping center would be shared 400 times. A follow-up post clarifying that no such incident had occurred, that the original post had been traced to a circulating legend with no local verified incident attached, would be shared perhaps 15. The correction is useful. The story is alive. These are not the same kind of thing, and the difference in what they do, in what they are able to do, is not a measure of human credulity, so much as a measure of the very specific kind of work that a story is built to perform. A woman standing in a parking garage in 2019, phone in her hand, having just read the local Facebook post, was doing what women who had heard this story had always done. She paused. She looked at the back of her car before she opened the door.